Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And before anything else, why don't we just take a moment to um, let ourselves kind of settle in to where we are and when we are. And there's lots of ways that we can do that, but one common way that the Buddha recommended is to sit comfortably with our back straight, but not, tense, just comfortably relaxed, straight back. And whether with our eyes open or with our eyes closed, whichever you prefer, to just pick a spot on your body where you can feel the sensations of the rhythm of the breath as the breath comes in, as the breath goes out. Just let your attention settle on one spot. And each time the mind wanders, which it absolutely will, you can just notice that, and you can just gently bring the attention back to the sensations on that spot. Again and again and again, like that. Let's do that for a couple of minutes. And then we can turn our attention to our motivation for being here today. And we can think about the fact that we had a virtually infinite number of choices about what we could be doing for the next hour and a half. And that out of all those choices, we chose to come together here and talk together and think together about the teachings of the Buddha. And so let's think for a moment about why we're making that choice. And perhaps we might want to feel connected. We might want to feel the pleasant feeling of doing something meaningful for a little bit of time. And if so, that's fantastic. Let's see if we can want more than that. Perhaps we can want to think about things in different ways, to consider things in different ways, such that it will have an impact, not just for the few minutes that we'll be together, but for a longer term in this life. And that's fantastic. That's fantastic. But let's see if we can want even more than that. maybe we can think in terms of future lives if we ourselves think in terms of future lives. And so we might hope that whatever we do here today might reverberate in ways that will help us beyond this life, but into the future as well. And that's fantastic. Let's see if we can want even more than that. Maybe we want to learn things here that might take us on the path to liberation from all suffering, so that we can eliminate all of our suffering. Whew, that's fantastic. What more can we want than that? I can think of only one thing. Maybe we can approach this with the desire that whatever we learn here will help us eliminate the suffering of all sentient beings, that will help us eliminate suffering wherever it exists, to bring joy wherever it's lacking, to bring peace, comfort, well-being, loving kindness everywhere. So to whatever extent we might feel comfortable doing that, to whatever extent we might feel comfortable even just entertaining that thought, maybe we can approach this time together by thinking, let me do this with the hope of being able to sow happiness wherever I walk, to bring peace, joy, well-being, wisdom, compassion to everybody. And so with that intention, with that aspiration, we can do everything that we're going to do today, starting with opening our eyes if they're closed and chatting. All right. So I was very kindly invited to join you. Hold on, I call it my screen samba. To join you to talk a little bit about making the Buddha's wisdom our own, right?
Gus, may I
Yes.
introduce you a little bit?
Oh,
Yeah.
sure, if you'd like.
Yeah, so just on behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome Gustavo to our center. He is, generally you can find him as a teacher at Shantideva Center up in New York. That's where he's most known for. So we're grateful that they were able to share him and that he was able to find time in his schedule to join us. And it's my hope that this is only the first course that he's able to lead for us. He's a wonderful teacher, and so we hope that we will forge an enduring relationship over the years. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Thank you. All right. So so in terms of making the wisdom of the Buddha our own, I think there's something so interesting about this topic from two angles, at least. From one angle, we could say that making the wisdom of the Buddha our own is the entire point of Buddhism, right? So there's that. And I think it also really points to something in Buddhism that I think is what so many of us in the West find most attractive about it, which is that it is about wisdom and it is about making something our own. You know, it's not about following something, it's not about believing something, it's not about being told what to do and what not to do by some external authority. Um, it's about well, it's about us, and that tends to be our favorite subject, but I think that's true in any culture. um, but there's an interesting tension, I think, that can come up when we think about, well, when we think about what we're saying there, when we think about that, because if Buddhism on the one hand is telling us that we shouldn't be taking things on faith, and we shouldn't be listening to external authority, but we should be figuring things out for ourselves. Well, then what else can it say besides that? Like, uh, what else can it teach besides that? Because if it's telling us, figure it out for yourself, then if it tells us anything more, it sounds like maybe it's contradicting itself. Like, do we believe anything else that the Buddha said? Do we follow anything else that the Buddha said? How does that kind of fit in? And I think there's, well, to use a Buddhist turn of phrase, I think that's a question that's important in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end of the path. In the beginning, when we're thinking about what is Buddhism all about, like, does it make any sense to me? I think that it's an important question to understand, like, what's the idea here? What's the expectation of how I'm going to approach it? In the middle, I think we can become really complacent sometimes if we're not careful, and we kind of can rest on our laurels a little bit and kind of think, oh yeah, well, I trust the Buddha now, and the Buddha says this, so that's good enough for me. And I think that way fundamentalism lies, so that's dangerous. And at the end, well, I don't know, I can't speak to the end. I don't know what that looks like just yet, but that I think that the principles involved apply all the way through on the path. So some of the topics that kind of came to mind for me, that I think might be, if it feels helpful as we go along, might be some helpful things for us to touch on. One is the question in the first place of, is Buddhism a religion? Which, if you've been involved in Buddhism for more than 6 or 7 minutes, you've probably either been asked or been told one way or the other about that. I think also related to that, what does Buddhism have to say about faith, right? And then leading from that, some of the central topics in Buddhism: how to be a wise student, how to discern the truth, and then perhaps most importantly of all, how to let the truth change our entire mental structure, which in more traditional Buddhist terms, we would say how to realize the truth that we've discerned. So maybe to start with, let's start with, let's start from the basics. Let's start with the question, what is Buddhism? Here's a word that I'm throwing around: Buddhism, Buddhism, Buddhism. And what do I mean by that? What is Buddhism? First of all, Buddhism is a Western word. Buddhism is a word that a few hundred years back, the Catholic Church, is my understanding, they were sending out missionaries to different parts of the world, to bring Catholicism to people. And again, as I understand it, they wanted to strategize different ways to talk to different groups of people, in terms that they would respond to. And so they had this concept of religion, and they kind of had this thought that, like, what every group has their own religion. And so they just kind of labeled different religions based on the features that kind of stood out to them. And one group got labeled Buddhist because they talked about Buddha a lot. Interestingly, I think the Hindus got the short end of the stick because they just got labeled based on the fact that they lived around the Indus River. Like, it's like these people all believe different things, but they all live near this river. So let's just call them this riverists. And so here we are, right? A more internally Buddhist way of saying of somebody that they're Buddhist, one way is to say that they follow the dharma of the Buddha, which of course raises the question of what does the word dharma mean, but let me leave that aside for now. The idea being that, other people follow other dharmas. And one very sweet way that in Tibet, people would say that they're Buddhists is they would say that they're inner beings. And one explanation that I've read about that is that that means that an inner being is someone who looks for the source of happiness and the end of suffering inside. Like, I want to be happy. Instead of looking like this, I'm going to look like this, right? I'm going to look for happiness in this direction rather than that direction. But that's about the terminology, the etymology of the word. What is it then? Like, whether you call it Buddha Dharma, whether you call it inner beingness, whether you call it Buddhism, what is it that we're talking about? Well, whatever it is, it's a whole set of things. But what they all have in common is this: they're all premised on the idea that we don't want to suffer, and yet we're suffering, right? That we want to be happy, and yet we're not happy, right? Not every instant of every day, but generally. And furthermore, that the way to find happiness, the way to end suffering, is going to involve changing the entire structures of our minds. That right now, the way our minds are set up, it's nothing innate about the mind. It's not that the mind has to be this way. It's that just right now our mind is organized in such a way that our minds are basically suffering creating machines. Hatred, greed, delusion making machines. And what we want to do is we want to restructure the mind so that instead the mind can become a bliss generating machine, right? A compassion, peace, wisdom making machine. And so everything taught in Buddhism, okay, this isn't what I'm about to say. This isn't like in the traditional text. This is something I'm saying, right? But I'm going to sit here and I'm going to say that everything taught in Buddhism is either a method for directly changing the structure of our minds, or it's a method for facilitating the process of changing the structure of our minds, or it's an explanation of the goals and the processes involved for changing the structure of our minds, right? So it's almost like a little bit like science and technology, right? It's either a technology itself, here's how you change your mind, or here's how you facilitate the process of changing your mind, or it's more about like the science, like the theory behind it, like here is how it works, here is why we're doing it, and so forth, right? Am I making sense? Like, follow me? Yeah, okay. But here's the thing. A lot of these explanations and a lot of these methods, they run completely counter to the kind of the current common wisdom that's prevalent in our society in the West, right? I mean, historically, it's run completely counter to common wisdom everywhere, but there are ways in which it runs completely counter to our, when I say common wisdom, I mean, like, I don't know if anybody ever watched Game of Thrones, but there was this one phrase that the Dothraki, the guys of the Dothraki, they would use, that would drive me nuts. Like whenever they would say like, oh, like, how do you know that blah, 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 blah? They would say, oh, it is known. So common wisdom is like that. It is known, like, anyway, so a lot of the things in Buddhism run like completely counter to the common wisdom in the West, to what it is known in the West. And that's in terms of it's in terms of like the explanations themselves. So rebirth in Buddhism, that's, I think, the big one for us in the West. Like that seems to be like the sticking point. Karma, interestingly, my personal impression seems to be that bizarrely, karma a little less so than rebirth. It feels like somehow we have a slightly easier time accepting karma than we do accepting rebirth, which from a Buddhist point of view makes no sense. But that's a separate that's a separate it would be a little bit like saying like there is no jug, but it is red. It's like anyway. Um so those are some explanations that I think that run counter to our MO in the West. But in terms of the goals too, one goal, like one, it's a sub goal, but one kind of target in Buddhism is to completely eliminate anger, including righteous anger. And that runs really counter to a lot of things that we perhaps assume in the West about the motivating power of anger and the necessary, like anger as being not just a sufficient cause, but a necessary cause for motivation, for social justice and things like that. And then too, in terms of methods, some of the methods in Buddhism run very counter to our current Western thing. And I keep using the word current because these things really change. These things really change. Things go in and out of vogue and things like that. But currently, concepts like rituals, like it's hard to even use the word without begging the question, like one is tempted to say religious rituals, but that's already begging the question. But like certain rituals, that's very counter to the current Western sense of how things work, and also how to build our own paths and things like that. And then too, things like guru yoga, like, like how to relate to a teacher. That also, the teachings as they stand also, I think, run completely counter to our way of thinking in the West. And having said that, I just want to make the disclaimer that let me put it to you this way. The teachings on Guru Yoga that we in the West object to most strongly are teachings that don't really exist in Buddhism, right? It's based on, there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of straw man. Asterisk see see other conversation. Like basically there's a whole there, that's a very, very rich thing. So I think the question is what gives, right? Like here we're saying that Buddhism is supposed to be free of dogma, supposed to be free of, it is so because they say so. And yet here are all these Buddhist claims apparently that go completely against what our common sense tells us. So the question I think naturally arises, is Buddhism a religion? Yeah, I think, is Buddhism a religion? And here too, the question is a funny one because the concept of religion is a Western concept. The concept of religion is a concept that if you look at it closely, it applies, I think, very comfortably to Christianity. I don't know enough about Islam to be able to say, but perhaps it applies comfortably to Islam. It already starts to get tricky when you get to Judaism, because there are lots and lots of Jews in synagogues on holidays who don't believe in God, and it already starts to break down. But then when you get to things outside of the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman West, it becomes very hard to say all over again. It becomes very, very hard to say. And so I'll tell you what I've personally settled on when people ask me this question. When people ask me, is Buddhism a religion? I find that everybody has something different in mind when they use the word religion. And I found that it's not really worth the debate to try to prove that it is or try to prove that it isn't or try to prove that their definition makes sense or doesn't make sense. What I've come to start doing is to ask them, what do you mean by the word religion? And then to answer yes or no based on that. So if they say, oh, religion is the worship of a creator deity, let's say, okay, no, then Buddhism isn't. If they say, oh, a religion is any system that involves claims about what happens after death, and say, oh yeah, sure, it is, you know, and that's good enough for me. you know. At the end of the day, of course, Buddhism is what it is, just like anything else. And how we fit it into categories depends entirely on our definition of categories, right? Um, I just want to know if the things I'm saying, like if this is connecting, if this is feeling relevant, like, does anybody have any thoughts or questions or okay. All right. Um, all right. So then in relation to all of that, there is one very important text in the Buddhist canon, which is probably more important in the West than it's, I'm just guessing, than it's ever been in its 2,600-year history. It's called the Kalama Sutra, and you might have heard of it. And it's been said, and I think with good cause, that is probably the single document most responsible for the spread of Buddhism in the West. And what it is the Buddha, he did it. His approach wasn't to say, oh, okay, I've become enlightened, so let me go stand on something tall and then just say, come unto me and I shall tell ye. The Buddha's approach was to just be, and then people would ask him questions and he would answer them, right? Based on the context in which they were asking, based on their need, based on what they were getting at. And so at one point, there was this group called the Kalamas, and they were just completely like baffled and dizzied because apparently, like where they were living, like teachers would come by every so often, and each would kind of make a different set of claims very convincingly. Like some would say A is B, and then the next one would say like, no, A is not B, A is C, and like almost like a tennis game, I guess. And so they went to the Buddha and they said, what do we do? Like, we're confused. Like, how do we know? How do we, And the Buddha's answer, which he gave very forcefully, if he repeated it a couple of times, he listed several things that he said, don't go by this, right? He said things like, don't go by somebody said so, first of all. Don't go by it is known, Don't go by, like when I think about it a little bit, I guess that makes sense. Don't go by, oh, it's written in an ancient text. Don't go by, well, my teacher said it, therefore it has to be true. Don't go by any of that. He said to go by two things. He said, go by what happens when you actually try it out. When you actually implement it, what is your experience? I'm debating whether I should tell this anecdote or not. I think I'll tell this anecdote. So a little disclaimer. So my livelihood, I'm a psychotherapist, right? And I subscribe to the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and that family of therapy, as opposed to psychodynamic therapy, which is a little bit more like more along the lines of like Freud and that. It's, I mean, of course, it's changed a lot. And in CBT, when somebody comes in for treatment, like we figure out like what's bothering you, and then our goal becomes to change the things that are bothering you, or to decrease your suffering, at least in some respect, and in a very open, collaborative way. Whereas in psychodynamic therapy, and again, there are many kinds, but there's a lot more of this therapist is a blank slate kind of thing, and whatever. Anyway, but the reason I'm saying this is that one time I was talking to somebody, like who, not an older person, but older than me, and she was a teacher, and she was enraged at the way her students were behaving in class. She's like enraged, right? And she was going on and on about it for a long time. And she said, they may just make me so mad. They just make me so mad. And then she said, well, I guess that's what I've been working on in therapy for the last 30 years, right? And as a CBT therapist, I had to bite my tongue, because I wanted to say, it's not working. It's I don't begrudge you the therapy you're getting at all. And at the same time, it's been 30 years and you're still this angry. Try something else, right? And so the Buddha, I like to think that the Buddha would be more of a CBT kind of guy, because it's all about, see, is this working? Is this working? And if not, then we have to do something different. But what's funny to me, and again, I'm not saying this to make a point about therapy, I'm just using that as an analogy to this point, but just to show how pervasive this actually is in our real lives, that I know a lot of people who have been in psychodynamic therapy for decades and who don't seem to have, when I've spoken to them, quite like a sense of like, is it working? Is it helping? Like, I guess so. My therapist says I've made progress. It fits the theory, And so again, that's not to knock psychodynamic therapy. It can be very, very helpful. And when it comes to the question of like, how do things exist? What will help me with something that I really want help with? The Buddha is saying, don't go by something fuzzy. Go by your experience, check it out, see what happens. Now, the second thing that the Buddha said to rely on in that scripture was like, what do wise people say? What do wise people say? And I know there's lots of commentary on that, but my sense, my own personal sense of probably what the Buddha meant by that is, it's like a saying in Tibet that be careful whose advice you listen to, because you'll become like them. So the people who you want to be more like, what did they say? I think is perhaps at least one piece of the way that we can understand that. So that, that is very much the Buddhist way, because, and it makes sense, because if what we're talking about is trying to end suffering, then really all that matters is whether the practice is ending suffering or not. It makes, like it makes no difference. Yes, well, the practice isn't ending suffering, but in theory, blah, 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 blah. And so says that blah, 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 blah. That's fine, but it's not doing, what it says on the tin. So what's the point? And yet Buddhism does make a lot of claims, like, again, one of them, Buddhism says that at the time of death, our subjective experience continues. It doesn't all just somehow go dark. Think like subjective experience changes dramatically as it stops, you know, interacting, I guess, with the brain and with the nervous system. But it continues, and that it then joins together with another nervous system, with another piece of hardware, as it were, and it kind of continues infinitely like that. And Buddhism says that that if you trace back, if you have some experience, any kind of experience that you have, if you look at its causes, you'll find that there are many necessary causes for the experience, many necessary causes for the experience, right? I mean, if you like, just to give you a sense of what I mean, like if you think about it, I'm wearing this shirt, right? Or this sweater. That's an experience. I'm having an experience of feeling the sweater, right? Well, one necessary cause for the sweater among countless is the grandmother of the manufacturer, right? Had the grandmother of the manufacturer not existed, the manufacturer would not have existed, and then the sweater would not have existed. I'd be having a different experience now. I'd be wearing something else, right? Necessarily. Does that make sense? It doesn't feel like I'm like saying something bizarre, right? We don't think about that. But that's true. So one necessary cause of the sweater is the grandmother of the manufacturer. Lord knows that's not the only necessary cause, right? You know, like the materials, the grandfather of the manufacturer, and so on ad infinitum. Well, what Buddhism says is that if you look at any experience that you have, one of the necessary causes of that experience, among many, but one of the necessary causes of that experience will be the aftermath of some action that you've done in the past. I know that sounds a little complicated, but you know, for you to have a certain experience in the moment, your mind had to have been set up in such a way. And if you trace the necessary causes of the way that your mind was set up, one of them will be some micro decision that you made in the past, some impulse that you followed, some action that you did, right? And so that's in a very, very oversimplified nutshell, that's what we call karma. You know, that's what karma is all about. And so that's another claim, right? That's another claim that Buddhism makes. You know, I'm just naming two. We could, you know, there are others. You know, Buddhism claims that that there is life in other planets and in other perhaps universes. That it's an infinite number of beings out there, and that the universe didn't have a beginning, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, that omniscience is possible. That's a doozy. Now, the interesting thing about that is that all of those claims that are fundamental to Buddhism, they're what are called tenets as opposed to dogmas, right? A tenet is, it comes from Latin, tenere or something like that, which means to hold, which is also the root of Dharma, but that's neither here nor there. A tenet is a position that is held within a certain system, right? But why is it held? It can be because it's a conclusion that was arrived at, right? So, for example, you know, the impact of natural selection on the evolution of species is a tenet of modern biology. It's not a dogma. It's not a matter of faith. It's not a premise even. It's the conclusion that's been arrived at, right? I remember back in 2003, I was at Kopan Monastery in Kathmandu for a month. And there was this moment where I witnessed something that I never forget. There was a Tibetan monk and a Western Buddhist nun chatting. And she was saying to him, she said, in the West, many people believe that we are descended from monkeys. And he said, monkeys? And in a flash, who knows if I was right or I was wrong, but in a flash, it's like I felt like I was seeing what was happening, right? I felt like I could see that this guy was hearing this as if it were a myth, like, in this tribe, some people believe that the universe was an egg laid by a giant lizard. And in this tribe, some people believe that human beings are descended from monkeys, and he was just respectful. But I could have told that, or it seemed to me that he would have reacted in the same way if she had said fireflies, in the West, some people believe we're descended from firefly. It's like, oh yeah, sure, people believe all sorts of things, right? And I had such an urge to grab that monk by the shoulders and say, no, 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 you don't understand. This is not a myth. This isn't a myth. This is a conclusion that we've come to, right? This is something that we've established scientifically. And there were two reasons I didn't do that. The first, because I wasn't invited and it was none of my business, but that was the minor one. The major reason I didn't do this is because it occurred to me that, anybody would say this of their tenets on some level, perhaps, at the very least, they'd say this isn't a myth, this is true. But I have reason to actually say this. But how would I explain this reason, right? This is my thought anyway. Well, to explain this, I'd have to explain, how natural selection works, which would involve having to explain random mutation of genes, which would involve having to explain something about genetics, which would involve having to explain something about the structure of cells and how cells, and that would involve just like a basic explanation of biology, which in effect would involve having to explain the scientific method. And so I realized that I could explain this to this man convincingly in a few years. But I didn't have a few years. I was leaving Nepal in a few days. And so it had to sit like that, it had to sit like that, where this guy, again, this is my assumption, but this guy seemed to me to be hearing this as a dogma of Western culture. Whereas to me, it seemed like it's a tenet of Western culture, but one that's arrived at through a valid epistemological method, right? Well, the idea in Buddhism is that all of the tenets of Buddhism are like that. Okay? The idea in Buddhism is that all of the tenets of Buddhism are like that. I have a friend who's super smart, and I love him, and he's been learning a little bit about Buddhism. And I forget what his question was, but like a while back, he asked me a question, and I said to him, well, that's actually really easy. I could explain that to you in a year and 5 minutes. Like a year to give you all of the background, and then 5 minutes to answer the question, right? Similar to if that monk had said something like, well, if human beings are descended from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys around? I could explain it to you in a year and 5 minutes, right? So what do we do? So over in Buddhism, like as Westerners, we have an advantage in Buddhism that we don't have in terms of Western science, and that people in Asia don't have with Buddhism, right? And the advantage is this: we're not already taking this for granted. I think a lot of people in the West, if not most people in the West, probably believe in evolution, but have no idea why, right? It is known, right? And I'm sure that a lot of people in Asia, I would go so far as to venture that almost all, like in relative numbers, like almost all people in Asia who are of Buddhist, uh, who are born into Buddhist cultures, believe in rebirth and have no idea why. It is known. But because we're contemplating something here that's so foreign to us, that's so different from anything that we already think, we're in like a really cool position where we're almost forced to be scientists about it. We're almost forced to figure out why for ourselves. To an extent, to some extent, we can go on trust if we want. We don't have to, but we can. Time is limited after all. And so there is something to be said for, if I have a disease and the doctor says take this medication, there is something to be said for taking the medication before going to medical school and finishing medical school. Like if I trust the doctor enough. But in any case, and importantly also in this regard, I think one thing that is pretty widely known is that the Buddha never made any claims to any privileged knowledge that was inaccessible to anybody else, or that was inaccessible to us. He wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a deity, he was just an ordinary person, no different from us, right? He had already graduated medical school, and we haven't, but there's no magic, right? Any thoughts or questions or comments at this point? Yes, please, Nancy.
This isn't totally in regard to what you're saying now. Thank you for the explanation about tenets. That was good for me to hear. I would like to know more about you and your foray into Buddhism, how you found studies since then too. It would be interesting.
Yes, of course, sure. Well, it's been 21 years, because time does not rest when you're not paying attention. I was a freshman in college, my first semester. It was in September of 2001, but before the 11th. And I was taking a class on comparative world religions out of pure anthropological curiosity, right? I wasn't seeking something different. I was born and raised Jewish. My family wasn't very observant, but I was satisfied with that aspect of my life. And in September, our professor showed this video about, to kind of speak about interfaith dialogue. She showed a video called The Jew in the Lotus. It's a play on words for the jewel in the lotus, about this delegation of Jewish representatives of all different types of religiosity, who are invited to Dharamsala to speak with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to share like the secret of Jewish longevity in exile, which I think, I still, like, when I think about it, I think like Dalai Lama is really smart. It's like, okay, we want our culture to survive in exile. It's been decades. Who can help us? Well, the Jewish culture has been surviving in exile for 3,000, maybe they can, and that was the first time I saw the Dalai Lama. And I'll tell you, like, when I saw the Dalai Lama, something happened, right? Who knows? Something happened. And and everything started to change then. I never forgot. But anyway, but I still was thinking about it from the perspective of this is a really special person within his religion, and I respect that. And so then in that class, over the course of the semester, we did the unit on Judaism, we did the unit on Christianity, we did the unit on Islam, and then we did the unit on Buddhism, and boom, like it felt like somehow this is my language, like this speaks to me. I remember feeling like this says exactly what I've always believed, but much more so. Um, and but I was torn because I felt a strong attachment to my identity as being Jewish, you know, and I struggled with that for a while, and I think the emotional difficulty with that eventually passed. Like I remember, like I think the moment when I finally let go of that was when I said to myself, look, if God wants me to become Buddhist, what can I do? you know um but what lingered for me was doubt about these claims that I'm talking about these claims that are so different from ours. They all seemed to make sense to me after a while, at least after a while. But I kept thinking, like, yeah, but I mean, it seems like these are just things that are being said in the dark. Like, who knows, right? And so over the years, over the course of about 10 years, every spare moment I was trying to learn about this. I was trying to study it. I was trying to investigate it. I was trying to see, what how Buddhism approached asking and answering these questions, but also how Western scientists and Western philosophers approached all of that led me to study epistemology, which is the study of how do we know what we know, right? And it took me about 10 years to finally feel satisfied, feel like I'd answered all my questions. Is that the type of thing you were hoping me to share? Yeah. Any aspect that you'd like to hear more about that I didn't?
I don't know. How did you get into the Tibetan and,
Oh, yes.
and all that?
Oh, yes. That's a great question. Yes. Yeah, it was so funny. Well, in retrospect, it's funny. I felt really drawn when I first started learning about Buddhism. I felt really drawn to Tibetan Buddhism. I now recognize Gelug, the Gelug school, but also to Zen. And they seem to be, at the time, and I don't feel this way exactly anymore, but at the time, they seem to me to be making such different claims. And it felt to me like, well, these can't both be true. So which is it? Which is it? And what's funny is I have this distinct memory of going for a walk with my mom, my poor Jewish mom, who doesn't know from Buddhism, and saying, help me figure this out. Like, is Zen true or is Tibetan Buddhism true? And she didn't know what to say, but I was like, I need somebody to tell me, but I couldn't find anybody who could tell me. And then what happened was this. The summer after my sophomore year, I decided that I wanted to use the summer to go on retreat and to really kind of dive into this more. And so I was looking for opportunities to go on a retreat. And I looked all over the country and I couldn't find anything that I could afford. And then I remembered that there is this monastery called Kopan Monastery that seemed to continue to keep coming up in all the different books I read and all the different talks I went to. Even as it turns out, by people who aren't affiliated with the FPMT, like it's a Kopan Monastery. And so I went online and I looked up Kopan Monastery, and they had a freaking website. And this was in 2003, right? And it never occurred to me that a monastery would have a website. And when I read the website, I found out that I could fly to Kathmandu, stay there for a month, eat, drink, sleep, do a 10-day course, stay for an extra 20 days, and fly back for roughly a little less or about the same as the same price that it would take me to go on retreat for a week in the United States. And so I did that. And when I was there, like the way things were explained, the way things were done, the way people were, the way the place was, it was almost like, it's not that there's no going back, because there's no sense of going back or a sense of being like cut off from anything else, but it's like I felt at home. And so I've been pursuing that path ever since. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Just gonna grab my water. I had it set up over there where I was before. All right. So what do you guys think is the way I'm talking about these things? Does that feel helpful? Well, I guess you wouldn't say no, right? Like, so let me put it a different way. Are there any aspects that you were hoping to hear about today? Based on the course description or anything like that.
Gustavo, I
Mhm.
was just presuming, as you are beginning to, just some maybe more practical advice,
Mhm.
like daily issues, situations, work, family, groups of people not getting on, and how you'd use Buddha's techniques, teachings, understanding,
Mhm.
to try navigate normal life.
Yes. Yes, sure. Sure. Happy to talk about that. Happy to talk about that. And I think, that question too, I think relates back to this concept of belief and like truth and such, for the following reason. When there's conflict between people, very often what it comes down to is a sense that the other person is just obviously in the wrong and can't seem to see it, or can't seem to be willing to accept it. What's interesting, of course, is that the other person is relative to who is telling the story. It's always the other person. Like, I've never yet, I don't think ever, had somebody come up to me and say, I had this huge fight, and the whole problem is that I was clearly in the wrong and I refused to see it. I've heard when it was the other person a bunch. I guess it's just, I've just been lucky to know all the right people, right? And I think something that is true when we're thinking about philosophical topics is just as true when we're thinking about practical matters, which is this openness, this letting go of it is known, right? This sense of it's not me, with my truth, and you with your pseudo truth, and my job is to convince you, my job is to change your mind, but rather it's us together looking for the truth together, right? Trying to figure out the truth together. There's an expression in Portuguese that I've adapted a little bit, but basically I like to say, like, I'm not the owner of the truth. I'm not the owner of the truth. Like, let's explore and let's figure it out together. So mm, so there's a lot in Buddhism about letting go of the tightness with which we hold on to things. It doesn't mean we stop using things. It actually facilitates our ability to use things, right? Like if you have depending on the tool, I'm trying to think of like what would be a good example, but like if you have a pair of scissors, I guess, and you're just grasping it tightly in your hand, you can't use the scissors, right? You have to kind of loosen your grip and put your fingers through and just kind of let there be movement, and then you can use it. And that's true, I think, with a lot of things, if not most things, that if you think about the three poisons of the mind that the Buddha taught about, attachment, aversion, naivete, they're all about grasping onto tight. Attachment is grasping on very tightly to this is good, and without this there can be no happiness, right? Aversion is grasping onto this is bad, and as long as it exists there can be no happiness, right? And then if you think about fundamental ignorance, it's grasping onto I am real and my boundaries are here. Like this is the extent, this is the landmass on which I exists, and beyond that it is not I, and that boundary is very, very solid, and we grasp onto that very tightly. And conflict inevitably arises, because the truth is that no man is an island. The truth is that these boundaries aren't solid like that, and so we overlap with other people, and then it becomes a war for territory, a war over territory. It's like, no, the boundary is definitely here. No, the boundary is definitely there. And so now we're fighting over this area, right? As opposed to like a looser perspective of let's figure this out. And it's hard because we believe our thoughts so freaking much, right? I remember, this is like a clumsy example because it requires explanation, but it was so stark to me that I always think about this. Years ago, my husband and I went through a phase where we were buying this like frozen meal of some kind, that we both would eat, separate, like we would both make it. And one day my husband, we were living in an apartment that had an upstairs, and so my husband was upstairs, and I wanted to make, yes, I remember, I wanted to make the meal, but we didn't have any more large bowls. Okay. And so I went up to him and I said, I forget why I had to ask him. And I said, like, for some reason, it's like, do you know where the large bowls are? I can't find the large bowls. Like, why? I said, I'm making the meal. He said, oh, no, you don't need to make the meal. You don't need a large bowl for it. You can use a medium bowl, right? And I said, well, no, it doesn't fit. It won't fit. And he said, no, it fits. It will fit. And I said, okay. And I knew he was wrong, but, like being a Buddhist, being a bigger person, like I went downstairs and I took a medium bowl and I took the meal, and you could tell that like the thing wouldn't fit by like 40%, And I came back up and I said, it's really not going to fit. It's like, it will fit. I do it all the time. I have it in the medium bowl all the time. You think you know where the story is going, by the way, but you don't. Just so you know, I'm not wasting your time to that extent. And And so I came back down. I tried to fit the thing. Obviously, it didn't fit. And then I came back up and I grabbed a medium bowl, an empty one, because the other one's like overflowing. I couldn't. I grabbed it. I said, "Is this what you mean by a medium bowl?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "And you're talking about the such and such meal?" And he's like, "Yes." And I said, "It doesn't fit. It does not fit. It doesn't fit, you know?" And at this point, right? At this point, I am attached to my truth because I've witnessed it with my own freaking eyes, right? Like he's gaslighting me over here, right? And so he came downstairs. And you know what? On the package, which I hadn't read in months because we'd been eating this for a long time, there were two sets of instructions. There was a set of instructions for making the thing in the microwave, and there was a set of instructions for making the thing on the stove. And apparently he had always been making it on the stove, and I had always been making it on the microwave. And to make it in the microwave, you have to put it in the bowl first, and it's not thawed yet, and it doesn't fit by a mile. But when you make it on the stove, you get it. So it's hard to wrap our minds around how the most obvious things ain't necessarily so, right? Most obvious things. And then when it comes to questions that bring up a concept of morality, forget about it. Forget about it. Because now there's a lot at stake. I mean, people can fight over the size of bowls, for crying out loud. You know, like when you're talking about things that affect the lives of countless people and things that involve questions of social justice and social injustice, it feels extremely dangerous, to say the least, to think like, oh, it's all relative. And it would be dangerous. I think it would be dangerous to say, oh, it's all relative, you know, like, oh, genocide, you know, it depends, right? Of course not. Of course not. And when it comes to what action to perform or not, it's important for us to be as clear as we possibly can. You know, it's important for us not to think relativistically, like, oh, well, you know, in the big scheme of things, or, oh, I'm sure there's many points of view. But when it comes to judging others as people, that's different. That's different. Then I think it's really important to have a loose touch, a very loose touch. The vast majority of the time, we don't need to judge people in the first place. Like nothing is gained and nothing is lost by judging somebody or not judging somebody. The vast majority of the time. Let me share this too. When I was studying, well, you know, like when I started studying Buddhist logic, there's, you know, Buddhists, like we love to categorize things and list things, right? So there's lots of ways that that logical proofs are categorized in Buddhism. But one of the ways is that we can categorize it into 4 types of proofs. And I'm not saying this, you know, for the content of what of the proofs, because it's more complex. But basically, you know, there's proof by the power of nature, proof by the power of a perfect proof of nature, a perfect proof of effect, a perfect proof of the non-observation of what is suitable to be observed, and a perfect proof of the non-observation of what is not suitable to be observed, right? Okay, you get it. I'm just listing words. But here's why I'm saying this. Because when you study each type of proof, you start by talking about why did the Buddha teach this? Like, why is it important for us to study this? And for the first one, a perfect proof of nature, we need to understand it to understand the first noble truth, which is the truth of suffering. We have to understand suffering. We have to understand proof by the power of nature. The second one, the perfect proof of effect. We need to understand that one to be able to understand the second noble truth and the fourth noble truth, right? To understand the causes of suffering, to understand the path to the cessation of suffering. The third type, perfect observation of what is a perfect proof of the non-observation of what is suitable to be observed. We need to understand that to understand the third noble truth, right? Which is, it's emptiness and cessation and all of that. Now you'll notice that there's one type of proof left, but we've already covered the Four Noble Truths, right? So the first three types of proof are to establish the Four Noble Truths. There's one more type of proof. What is that for? The reason the Buddha taught the perfect proof of non-observation of what is not suitable to be observed is so that we wouldn't judge other people. Whew. Right? Like when you hear that, like on a par with the Four Noble Truths, it makes you think, right? And when I was studying this, these proofs are laid out and it's fascinating. And I was reading about this and I was wrapping my mind around it. And finally it clicked for me that I actually cannot know like what other people's motivation is. I cannot know. And at first, there's something about it that feels very aversive and disorienting and upsetting and this and that. But when it finally settled in, and I finally decided to stop trying to assess why other people do what they do and, and so on, two things happened. One is that nothing changed for the worse, nothing. I didn't become less, politically involved. I didn't become less of an advocate for whatever little bit I might try to advocate for. Nothing changed in that direction. But two things did change. One is I felt immensely more at peace, and I have ever since. And the other is that I have a lot more time in my day, because I was astonished by how much time in my day was spent by judging other people. It takes time. It's astonishing, and nothing is gained by it. Nothing, right? So letting go, letting go of things like that, like of this kind of like this like obsessive need to be certain of things that we can't really be certain about. Because there are things we can be certain about, right? But not this type of thing. That is a huge, huge thing. That is a huge thing. I mean, if you think back through your life on all the times when it was clear as day to you that there was no justification for what somebody else had done, where you later found out that, oh my God, there was, right? Oh man, okay, I judged them too soon. I judged them harshly, etc., etc. Think about all the times when that's happened. And then try to think about all of the times when that's happened, but you never found out. Where you still think there is no justification because you didn't find out what the justification. And it's always something we can't imagine. It's always something we can't imagine. One time, there was this, where I was at school, I used to go very frequently to get lunch at this counter. And there was this guy, we kind of, friendly is even too strong. I remember we'd smile at one another, you know, like, hi, how are you? Okay, bye. And then one day he just didn't, right? One day he just didn't. And I was trying really hard to come up with a benign explanation for why but I couldn't come up with like, I couldn't think of a single reason why he would have been like just cold with me that day. And then when I was waiting to pay, I happened to glance back. Do you want to guess? Twins. You could have given me 100 guesses and I wouldn't have guessed it, right? So does this mean that the next time that somebody's really cold to me, all of a sudden, then it's twins also? No, probably not. Almost certainly not. But it's almost certainly something that I won't be able to think about. That, I think, is very important and very powerful. Doesn't mean we let people do whatever they want to do, right? Behaviors are behaviors. But in terms of that's just a bad person, like that, the person is just unreasonable. They're just doing this to hurt me. They're just doing this to this. They're just doing this to that. We just don't know. We just don't know. And to let go of trying to figure it out, or to let go of trying to establish it. I think a lot of healthy things come from that. Is that helpful? Good.
Very. It feels like a flood of release of like, oh yeah, wow. I'm definitely judging people, and my half sister we were brought up together, how like she treated myself and eventually our mum, you know, and then years later I found out, you know, something did happen to her for her to act in this completely demonstrous way, and I'm coming to terms, you know, with my judgment of her. But yeah, it's a brilliant explanation. Thank you.
I'm glad. I'm glad. And I thank you for sharing that, because another thing maybe that we could add is that it's so important, and with all of this, not to invalidate ourselves and not to gaslight ourselves. You know, like if somebody's doing something, we don't want to say, oh no, maybe they're not doing that. Like, you know, what's being done is being done. And even like, to go back to that insane example of the twins, it's not like when I found out that they're twins, it's not like, okay, then the next step is for me to say, I am stupid. What is wrong with me for having been upset? I mean, no, it's totally understandable, right? I think I'll defend it. It's totally understandable that I was a little, you know, hurt, a little like taken aback, and that I was confused. And both of those things can be true at the same time, right? If your half sister behaved in a certain way, that can be very hurtful, and at the same time, it can be not because she's a bad person. And at the same time, it's understandable that you might have thought for many years that it was because she was a bad person, right? In the same way that the other person's intention might not have been malignant, our intention might not have been malignant either. I mean, if you look at the way His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about the situation with China and Tibet, if the Dalai Lama can afford to do that in that situation, you know, because I say this because if I know it feels sometimes like there are situations where it feels like if I let go of being the owner of the truth, then I let go of my power. It feels that way, I think. Then I just kind of let the other person do whatever they want. And that's not true. That's not true at all. That's not true at all. It's not true at all. The more grounded we are in truth, the more power we have. In the last few minutes, we have any other thoughts, questions, comments?
I did want to mention that I have a pair of childhood friends who are identical twins, and they both are Starbucks baristas here in Oregon. So be prepared if you ever come here and get different reactions.
It will happen again. Good.
Yeah,
I need to write this down.
Guarantee you're not the only one that this has happened to. But it is a great anecdote to just understand. I mean, someone told me once, imagine that every person you pass is battling, every person that you walk by is battling an internal battle that
Yes.
you have no idea about, and compare and just try and understand that whatever yours are, people have at least that going on, and treat, when you happen upon people, just start at that point, and things can go much better. And this was way before I did any studying on Buddhism, and so just general principles that are then reinforced with some things in these studies. And so I appreciate that.
Nice.
Nice.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there's one way in which we're all the same, and there's one way in which almost all of us are different. The way in which we're all the same is in wanting happiness, wanting to maximize happiness, wanting to minimize suffering, right? Nobody has that any more intensely or any less intensely than anybody else. Every single sentient being has the same urgency for minimizing suffering as every other, the same urgency for maximizing happiness as every other. Everybody. From world leaders to insects to everybody. That's the way in which we're all the same. The way in which we're all different, not all of us necessarily, but the vast majority of us are different, is in our theories about how we can maximize happiness and minimize suffering. So any difference that we encounter with somebody else is going to be based on that. I mean, any behavioral or emotional or mental difference. I mean, of course, we have physical differences, but that's different. Any difference we encounter with somebody else is going to be based on that. It's what's happening right now is that we have different hypotheses, different theories about certain facts or about what will increase happiness and decrease suffering. If I'm being very thorough, I would say there's one other way in which it's going to be different. And that's in terms of our level of understanding of where the boundaries of the self are. If we have an understanding of a very tight boundary of the self around this guy, right? Then we'll just as intensely as anybody else want to maximize happiness, minimize suffering inside this boundary, right? If we have a boundary that includes like loved ones, then want to maximize happiness, minimize suffering within that boundary. If we have a very wide boundary, and ultimately if we see through the boundary in the first place, there's no distinction between inside and outside, then the same exact wish for happiness and wish to avoid suffering it's just for all beings. That's when we talk about things like great compassion, great loving kindness. Great compassion, great loving kindness is that very basic, the very essential desire for happiness, desire to avoid suffering, when we see through the boundaries that we were placing there before, right? But that difference is a difference in understanding, not a difference in good moral goodness. Some people are currently stuck with this mistaken appearance that like the world begins and ends here and everything else is scenery. you know, other people can see through that and they see that's not true. That's not true. Doesn't make the second kind of people better. It makes the second kind of people wiser, clearer. All right. Well, in closing then, why don't we take a moment to do what in Buddhism we call dedicate the positive potentials that we create. Like we were talking about in the beginning, how one of the tenets of Buddhism, one of the claims made in Buddhism is that every experience has one of its necessary causes can be traced back to some action we did in the past. Another tenet is that every action taken becomes a necessary cause for some potential future experience, even though it's not determined yet. You know, there's no matter of determinism. We don't know yet what that experience will be. And so we think we made many decisions, many little choices, many little actions over the course of the last hour and a half. Every time our mind wandered and we decided to bring it back, every time we heard something, we decided to think about it or question it or deny it or agree with it or whatever. Each of those is a little decision, is a little action. And each of those becomes the potential necessary cause for some future experience. And so we think these experiences that we're going to have in the future that stem from these actions, may they not be experiences of just like fleeting pleasure or things like that. May they rather be experiences that will lead us deeper into a path of compassion, a path of loving kindness, a path of equanimity, a path of peace, a path of joy and bliss, a path of courage and energy and wisdom, so that we can bring happiness, maximize happiness everywhere, and minimize and eliminate suffering everywhere. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, I'm looking forward to continuing this next Sunday. If anybody has any thoughts on any angle or aspect of this that they think would be helpful, I'm happy to hear. I have more thoughts that I can share about how to establish the truth in Buddhism and how to then really internalize that and change our minds. And I'm happy to talk about it from any angle that folks think would be helpful. Okay.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.